Hi, everyone. Thank you, Jayatidi, Chandru, and PERI colleagues, Bob, Jerry, Nicole, everyone, for giving me this opportunity to present. This is an ongoing research which I thought of presenting this idea and get your feedback. And the idea is basically that here over the last 2 days, we heard about this discussion that the developing countries need funds from the developed world of $1 trillion. But how does this fund gets distributed among the developed countries? Who takes up the responsibilities? Now, we know that the $100 billion funds that was committed was not met. And that time there were a lot of discussions about who is taking up the responsibility, who is to be blamed. Now, this is an attempt to do as an exercise to find out who can take up this responsibility. Now, this audience is well aware of this 3 crises which we are seeing in the global economy, which many has called polycrisis. Or one is, we know we just came out of the COVID crisis. Then there was this fear of economic recession, but the bigger wave of climate change crisis still haunts. And as we know, the developing countries are the most vulnerable in that sense because they don't have the resources to cope. And also, the research shows that the impact on those economies will be the most felt. But at the same time, I also believe this is an historic opportunity to break out of whatever has been going on across the historical way and to think out of the box. If we can develop the global corporations, if we can come out with new ideas, it would also give us an opportunity to think in a different way rather than what has been done yet. And this is an exercise in that regard. Now, the presentation has been designed in 4 ways. Why we need to do it, how we can do it, or what can be done, how we can do it, and finally the results. Now, about this slide actually shows you that there is this whole discussion which comes out from the global south. It's about the carbon space left. So they argue that the developed countries have already used up their resources, the carbon. We have very less left. Now they are actually trying to pull out the ladder which they have used to develop. And out of that argument, a section from there, even including the progressives, argue that we need to use that carbon space, including burning of coal, which this framework is a very strong framework to argue for equality. But at the same time, to extend that argument, to argue that the South has the right to burn coal would lead to a disaster in terms of the climate change. So this carbon space left is actually the very light blue area which you see. The lower is the limit to the 1.5 degrees Celsius, which in many international negotiations, as we see, is already breaking down. The 2 degrees Celsius is still something which we can achieve definitely if we try. And why is it so concerning? It's like that speed of the Titanic. We can see the iceberg, but we are going on full scale. To just let you know, 50% of the emissions which has happened historically has happened over the last 3 decades only. That's why it's such an alarming crisis. If we go on at this pace, then it would become more and more difficult. Now, coming to the second point, why this justice? The justice is needed because those who have contributed the least to this problem will bear the maximum brunt of it. And this graph by Hickel at the published, I'm borrowing it from there, the Lancet Planetary Health, clearly shows the overshoot emissions and the climate vulnerability. Now coming to, there has been discussions on what do we mean by climate finance? So UNFCCC has a definition of climate finance. It may be vague or it might be a very broad definition, but the definition basically says that any finance whose expected effect is to reduce net greenhouse gas emissions and or enhance resilience to the impacts of climate variability and projected climate change. Based on that, many researchers, including the international bodies like IRENA, IEA, IPCC, have all come out of their estimates of what they think should be the need for this whole climate finance needs. And these are the various studies. I'm not going through all the numbers, but as you can see, IRENA estimates that there is a need for $5.2 trillion. IEA talks about $3.8 trillion, and IPCC talks about around $4.4 trillion. Now, that's why you will find that that day, 2 days before, Avinash Prasad was arguing that there is now slowly a consensus building among economists about the total amount of money needed for this whole transition process, including adaptability and the expenditures on agricultural, forest, and other land uses. Now, I tried to do my own estimations of this based on the IPCC's recent reports, where they argue for that the developed countries needs around 2 to 4% of their GDP, and the developing countries need around 4.4 to 9% of their GDP. It's a high range, but this is of the high confidence. And also, the developing countries, what they project needs almost 4 to 7-fold increase in what they currently are spending, and the developed countries needs around 3 to 5 times. So based on those, what I tried to do is that I came up with this number, which is very similar to what you saw there, which was around $3.9 trillion and $4 trillion. Now, just to be clear, none of the researchers can stand here and say this is the exact number. This is a range, this is a broad range which comes out of this, but it seems to be very much that this range is around $4 trillion the world would need to come out each year of this climate finance disaster. Now, where do we get this money? And this is where an important part comes out, that this is not only the progressives are talking about. Even in mainstream media, like Financial Times, Martin Wolf argued that the developing countries cannot get these resources on their own. They need finance from the Western world. And to quote him, if emissions are to decline rapidly, while emerging and developing countries still deliver the prosperity their populations demand, which they of course do, and there is a lot of discussion on that, there must be a huge flow of resources towards them, not least to finance climate mitigation and the necessary adaptation to higher temperatures. So this is not any idea anymore among the progressives or the left-leaning economists. This is an idea even the mainstream media is talking about. Having done that, so we estimate, this was a study done by the independent high-level expert group on climate finance, where by Bhattacharya et al., where they said that which also Avinash Prasad that they spoke about, which was like the world would need around $1 trillion. And from the developing countries would need around $1 trillion from the Western world. And my own estimation shows it's around $965 billion. Now, given that, so how do we do it? So just to go back to the last slide, one of the methodology which I apply here was a framework which the UN has already adopted. This was the 1992 framework which Jomo mentioned yesterday, which was the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So it says that you take up the responsibility which you had given the emissions and what capacity or capability you have. According to that, you need to finance your climate finance need. Now, we apply the same principle to the Annex II countries which are responsible for this advancement of finance towards the developing world, according to the UN. And so we are not trying to invent any wheel here. We are trying to go by the framework which is already set up within the UN. Now, the methodology I use is very straightforward. In terms of the capacity, I take two variables. One is the average GDP over a certain time frame, and the other variable which I use is wealth, that is to capture the capacity which these countries have. In terms of the responsibility, I use the variable carbon date. Now, what is carbon date? Carbon date is a concept which is also used by the carbon space framework, which is that how much carbon have you used up in the economy to sustain historically the amount of population you had. So if you, for example, the world has emitted around 2516 gigatons CO2 equivalent, out of which the US used up almost 22%, which is 553 gigatons. But the population they supported was only 4.3% of the global population. And these are historical figures. So given that, one can argue or one can make calculations to show that the US is carbon indebted to the world of almost 445 gigaton CO2 equivalent. So I apply the same principle for all the countries. Now, given that, what I do is I develop a few steps, and these are very simple mathematical steps which anyone can do. I normalize the variables. I create a PERI score index. In the PERI score index, 50% is given towards responsibility, 50% is given towards capacity, with equal divisions between the current flow of income, which is captured by the GDP, and 25% given to the historical wealth, which they have captured by actually doing all the emissions they have. Now, this PERI score index, based on that, I find out the Euclidean distance from the minimum to the top. So what it does is, if in the PERI score index you are at the top, you are most responsible to make the maximum payments. If you are at the bottom, you don't pay much or you don't pay almost nothing. It's very close to zero. And based on that, we try to find out, given that Euclidean distance, we try to find out what is the share of each country. Now, having done that, we find that these are the results, which are very simple results, which are nothing surprising for this audience, but I just want to draw your attention to the final figures which we got. So as you can see, this is the carbon date of the Annex II countries. This is only an analysis of the Annex II countries. You can see that the United States has the highest carbon date in that sense among these countries. So it's 445 gigaton CO2 equivalent. Next is Germany, United Kingdom, and remember, some studies, recent studies published by other scholars have shown that if you take colonialism into account, then this indebtedness goes up more. And we are not talking about all this. We are not talking about colonialism, we are not talking, it's just their national geographical boundaries, what they have emitted and how they are carbon indebted to the world. This is also based on production, not consumption, just to give you a... This is the GDP of the Annex II countries, among them the distribution. So again, as you can see, United States stands up around $21.1 trillion, followed by the other economies like Germany, Japan, Germany, United Kingdom, France. This is the distribution, which is very clear to everyone. And this is the wealth of the Annex II countries. Again, United States comes out at the top. So given this, it was a very simple exercise. You develop a PERI score index, which I did. So at the PERI score index, United States comes out at the front. At the top, Germany, Japan, United Kingdom, France, and this is how they can distribute among themselves. It's a problem of the developed world, how they do it, but we are just proposing that this is how you can do it. And this is, United States is responsible for 50% of that $1 trillion, Germany around 10%, Japan around 8%, the United Kingdom around 7%, France 5%, like that, you can see the distribution. Given this, this is how the amount which they have to deliberate comes out to. The United States has to pay to the world around $478 billion, Canada around $40 billion, Japan 76 is at some of the major figures, United Kingdom $70 billion. Now, in terms of, if you look at it, sometimes this nominal figures doesn't make much sense because what it means in relative to the size of the economy. Relative to the size of the economy, these are huge, actually. Because as Bob and others' calculations have shown, these economies themselves need around 2 to 3% of the GDP for their own transitions, which also the IPCC is talking about.
But if you look at this data, so they also need to contribute around 2.3%, which is very similar relative to the size of their economies to the developing world. And I am sure that there will be a lot of resistance at how can we give so much money to these poorer countries. Given this scenario, there is the other data which can be starking. Just look at it in terms of the wealth. In terms of the wealth, it's minimal. It's just 0.17%. A tax of 0.17% wealth tax can solve this problem, or 0.1. So it ranges from 0 to 0.24%, which is the max. So if these economies can tax their wealth, and the reason for the taxing the wealth is that this carbon which we are talking about, this climate change we are talking about, is not a present day phenomenon. It was accumulated over the years. It's a historical responsibility. So to discuss that, we need to bring in the concept of wealth into the discussion, because that wealth was generated by these economies by using up all the carbon spaces all throughout the history of capitalism, from 1850, they have been using up the space. So arguing for wealth is not some magic. It's simple, because all this wealth was created or was generated by using up those carbons. So in terms of the wealth, if we talk about, it's a minimal amount we are talking. And given the drastic inequality which exists across these economies and across these countries, it's important that these countries resolve their own problem. Maybe they just tax the top 1% or top 10%. But it's important that within the US, there is a discussion of how these richer classes can also, or given this inequality, how they can help in rescuing the poorer economies. Now, just to why this question of inequality is so important. The question of inequality is important not because we think as progressive economists that this is true. Even science, the scientific community, Nature, brought out with this editorial, and they said just a couple of months ago that if inequality is not addressed, the world is not going to be able to fight this crisis of climate change. How much we try, we need to tap on this unequal distribution of income and wealth that exists in the world today, and that would help us in solving this climate crisis, because as far as coming from with discussions from the developing countries, they too have an aspiration to grow. They also have that aspiration to develop, to teach their kids, to give proper health care and the basic needs. But given the constraints they are facing, they need the resources from the advanced countries to do it. Thank you.